In your great new book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, you talk up the need and the acknowledgments for a new history of the Depression. Existing accounts, as you point out in your introduction, tend to fall into one of the following camps, and there are the people who generally support FDR and his and Hoover's interventions into the economy and society as staving off fascism and communism after the stock market crash and then in 29 and the Depression kicking in a few years later. And additionally, you talk about how people in the supportive camp, what we might talk about how the 30s interventions kind of corrected a morally corrupt 1920s economic boom, which was widespread. Then the critics who tend to fall into another camp, that federal responses, especially by Hoover early on, tightening the money supply at by the Federal Reserve, Smoot-Hawley tariff, which kind of blocked American trade from doing much, actually caused the Depression, which was then extended and exacerbated by FDR's subsequent New Deal programs, et cetera. So your book is, the subtitle is A New History of the Great Depression. How does your book fit into these existing arguments, and then what new are you bringing to our understanding of the Depression?
Well, one of the important things about the existing argument is that it's all about Keynesianism and whether government spending can cure the economy when it's ill for the short term and the long term. And scholars overlooked the cost of uncertainty, what we would call now the unknown unknowns, in an economy. And because both administrations, especially the Roosevelt administration, was so unpredictable, that hurt the economy very much. When I went back and looked and saw the extent, I was astounded. So uncertainty is a factor that I thought needed to be explored. People who said, I will not invest until I know what's going to happen next.
And it's not just I know what's going to happen in the economy, but what the government is going to do.
What the government was very unpredictable, and everyone overlooked the cost of that. You heard the phrase bold, persistent experimentation, and we learned that was good. Somebody had to do something, was what we learned. But what I saw when I went back to the years, especially the second half of the Depression, was the enormous cost. There was a second thing, too, which is there's a school of economics called public choice theory that says, very simply, government is no better or worse than a business. It's a competitor.
Right.
It's
and it doesn't have moral high ground, but it also seeks to maximize its what it controls or its market share.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And if sometimes on the radio I use a crustacean image. It's like a lobster. It will eat anything. It wants to survive. It will compete with anything, and it can be a cannibal. So when you look back at the 30s, what you discover if you use the public choice lens is the extent to which it wasn't about a virtuous government and bad business people, but rather about people in office using that office to compete with the private sector for power. And much of that struggle in the book literally inhered in the power business utilities, because there's something about power that attracts strong people. And of course, as I go through it, you'll see in the book the government wins and the private company loses in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority.
I want to get to a point where we talk about Wendell Willkie, who emerges, I think, as an unlikely hero, or an unexpected hero in the book, and who was a power utility executive who fought with the TVA and the people who were trying to expand it. Just two things quickly. What public choice economics or public choice analysis did not really exist, certainly during the 30s and 40s. Can you just give a quick kind of intellectual history of where it comes from?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not so good at that, but what I would say is some of it comes from the left. There was an Italian called Puviani who wrote about it, who influenced very much our American public choice star, the inventor of modern public choice, I suppose, James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner. So you can even find it among the Marxists, similar thought, which says the power, the colonial power, the government is problematic and can hurt the little man. And talking in aggregates, whether you're a free marketeer or a more state-oriented person, is destructive, because life isn't about aggregates and managing an economy from the top. It's often about where the individual impulse is with the small man. And I think public choice focuses on that as well.
Well, and you also, and this brings me, I want to have you explain your title a little bit, but one of the things that's very striking about your book And actually, it reminds me of another great kind of Depression-era document, John Dos Passos' USA trilogy, where you weave in a lot of stories of people at the very highest level of power, whether we're talking about Andrew Mellon or Franklin Roosevelt and members of Roosevelt's cabinet and Brains Trust, and then poor people, both poor people as well as working class people, et cetera. It weaves together very nicely. By focusing on that obviously is one of the things that you're bringing to our understanding of the Depression, kind of its impact on day-to-day life and individuals. Talk a little bit about where The Forgotten Man comes from as a title.
The Forgotten Man phrase is one we know from Roosevelt. In 1932, on the Lucky Strike Hour, he gave a speech that was written in part by Ray Moley, his advisor. And Moley was a man you'd want to have at your dinner table today. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. And in that speech, Roosevelt spoke of the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And Moley wrote to his sister that he wasn't quite sure where he had gotten the phrase. But it was in the air because there was a provenance. Before, when they were children, or such men were children in the 1880s and 90s, there was a famous book, collection of essays called The Forgotten Man, and a famous individual lecture called The Forgotten Man. And the author of that was a Yale professor called William Graham Sumner. And Sumner had a quite different forgotten man. He put it algebraically. He said, A wants to help X. That's our philanthropic impulse. We want to help, X being the man at the bottom.
Right.
And B wants to help X. There's nothing wrong with that. We all have that impulse. It's charity or philanthropy. Comes a problem when A and B get together and pass a perhaps dubious law that coerces C into funding their maybe good project for X. C is the forgotten man, the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of. And that so rang a bell with me because I think it also has to do with today. We can maybe talk about this later, but when you look at the election and you see great powerhouses, the Democratic powerhouse, Hillary, the Republican powerhouse, maybe McCain, maybe someone else, and the individual voter says, where do I fit into this? I feel like a forgotten man. There's something very unfun about this election as it's beginning to unfold. And also, given our entitlement challenges, the forgotten man in the future will be the next generation who will pay for what Roosevelt created in this book.
Right. The Forgotten Man, I thought of it, which obviously was pulling off of Roosevelt's speech. There's the 36 William Powell movie with Carole Lombard called My Man Godfrey, where William Powell plays a bum who gets taken in by a socialite and becomes their butler or their manservant. And then at one point, and a fairly striking representation of poverty takes Carole Lombard to a Hooverville or a hobo town in New York, and there's a lot of discussion of the forgotten man in that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movie. I recommend it. It's a sort of a joke. Right. They have to find in a game a forgotten man. It's a scavenger hunt, I believe.
Okay. Yeah.
And she goes to the very sad Hooverville in New York, which really did exist, where there was this terrible poverty in this time, and collars one as a sort of pet. And he reforms the family because they are lost in their wealth. And the message of the film is not quite one I would agree with. It's that wealth corrupts. Well, maybe that is true. But that there's something intensely virtuous about the poverty of the very, very poor man, and that is superior to the wealthy man. And we have that in our religions, but I'm not sure it's so entirely true. The message is the forgotten man is great, and I think and somehow transcends it, and economics is bad because economics created the wealth for that family. Not to analyze a movie too much. So economics isn't bad. Economics is good, especially for the forgotten man who can come out of the Hooverville. So it was, but it's a wonderful movie, and there's also a song, The Forgotten Man. So this is something that meant a lot to the people of the time. And when Roosevelt people debated Hoover people or other right-wing people, the Liberty League, they were all familiar with William Graham Sumner. So they said, you have the wrong forgotten man. The forgotten man is the man who is waiting for the recovery that you are not delivering or that you are preventing. And And I like that because it plays all the way through the book, all the way through the history of the period.
One of the things that you talk about, particularly in the beginning sections of the book, is that Hoover and Roosevelt are not that different. Both, I mean, obviously one is much more successful than the other as a politician, but that they share certain types of mentalities and also they shared certain types of policies. Can you talk a little bit about what Hoover did, or the Hoover administration did that was wrong, and then how FDR either changed that or adapted it or just kind of glommed onto it?
Well, it's amazing how much temperament matters.